Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast. I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts. And today we have a pretty exciting episode ahead. We're going to be talking about language learning with Gabriel Wyner. Gabriel Wyner is a pretty cool person to talk about language learning because he's actually written a book called Fluent Forever.
Just some random guy who doesn't speak any languages.
We just found him on the street. He seemed cool. No.
Very well credentialed as a language learner. He's learning Japanese right now, which would be his seventh language.
Which is pretty impressive for me since I'm struggling to stay on track with my second language of Espanol.
Yeah, and that's kind of the reason we have had learned about Gabriel and then had him on the podcast. In my attempts to not suck at Spanish, I had found gotten deeper and deeper into language learning, reading blogs, and came across his blog and eventually the book. And his book, Fluent Forever, is kind of like, I don't know, it really goes into a lot about like learning as a science outside of language learning. And it's just like almost like all like the best practices I found in a whole bunch of other places. It's like, oh yeah, he's got them all in there. It just seems like the really good method to learn languages and to learn that learning languages really isn't as hard as you might think it is.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely been struggling, especially since being back in Canada, to stay on top of Spanish. And reading Fluent Forever, I felt like I was re-inspired to learn because I was like, okay, learning Spanish isn't actually as hard as I'm making out to be in my mind, which is pretty cool. And Gabriel actually came across sort of his methods he was an opera singer, professional opera singer, learning languages, and then he was sort of forced into quickly learning French. So
yeah, and you'll hear about that in the podcast episode. We don't want to drone on with the intro.
Definitely.
But the thing I want to say in the intro before we get into the podcast, because the podcast does kind of focus on more of the, more on language learning, but a lot of people we met traveling South America had made some attempts at learning Spanish, but it seemed like a lot of people were just kind of resigned to like, whatever, don't really need more than a couple phrases. And I think a lot of that has to do with kind of a false perception that language learning is, uncomfortable, not enjoyable, and really hard.
And time consuming as well.
Yeah. Yeah, but there are a lot of ways to make it a lot more enjoyable, a lot more fun, and happen a lot quicker. And it does add a ton of value to your experience traveling if you are learning language.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to talk about that with Gabriel Wyner in the interview. So here he is.
Okay, so today on the podcast, we're joined by Gabriel Wyner, who's the author of Fluent Forever, a book about, would you say, like just mastering language learning?
Yeah, I mean, I guess about how to do learn languages quickly, and also kind of about the memory processes that go on behind that.
Yeah, that's actually, so just like reading through it, there was so much good stuff about just memorizing. Even if your maybe language isn't your muse, you could take so much out of it from that.
I think one of the, we'll get into probably soon in terms of what the challenges are when it comes to language learning, but, and I kind of have this, I go at languages just from a memory standpoint, but memory is memory. And it's like we don't, nowadays there's not much stuff we actually need to memorize. Like we have Google and generally that takes care of most of our needs in terms of things that are supposed to be in our brains. But languages are one of those things where you really need to memorize them. But for people who have other needs in terms of memory, like test taking, and things like that, these things apply to pretty much anything. It's about memory and how that works.
Yeah, and then so you're also opera singer, in addition to author. Speak 6 languages. Is that the number?
At the moment, yeah. I mean, I'm working on the 7th Japanese, but I in no way speak Japanese. I know some words in Japanese, and I know some writing system stuff in Japanese, but I do not speak Japanese at the moment.
That's pretty incredible. I'm working on language number 2, and I've been struggling, so it's pretty amazing.
Well, I know what that's like.
Yeah, so that was part of the reason why we wanted to have you on the podcast is Ryan and I both studied and learned Spanish while we were in South America for 6 months last year. And it's super difficult to stay motivated when you're learning constantly, but you feel like there's still like this massive hump to get over in terms of actually becoming fluent.
Absolutely. No, it can be a challenging thing, especially when you don't know how to do it. I mean, I think that's one of the issues with that a lot of people run into is that like people will give them instructions like, hey, learn this language, or hey, learn this vocabulary, or learn this grammatical thing, but not that many people talk about the tools you need to actually succeed in that.
So getting into the tools you need to succeed in that, what would you say the big tools are?
I think that people go into language learning with some misconceptions that are totally understandable. There's sort of the first main one, which is that there are people who are good at it, and then everyone else is terrible at it. And that, once you get past the age of something, 5 or 7 or 12 or some number that you're past, that therefore you're going to be bad at this thing. And that ends up actually not being true. This idea that kids are better than adults at learning languages, it comes from this experience that many people have had where they go in the country and they've like, as you guys have, and you've worked really hard learning this language, and you show up and there's a kid who speaks better Spanish than you do.
Totally.
And it's like not fair, because that kid has definitely not done any of the work that you've done, and they're correcting your grammar and they're just being like kids.
Yeah.
And it feels terrible because you're like, this isn't fair. Like that kid is has some sort of gift that I don't have. And it's true, they do have a gift you don't have. They've had 15,000 hours of Spanish exposure, and you've had like 100. And that's the part that's actually not fair. And if you correct for that, you look at the kid who you take one of those kids, one of those magically gifted kids, and you transplant them to France. And you give them 500 hours of exposure, and then you do the same thing. You go to France and you get 500 hours of exposure. You're going to have better French than that kid, like every single time. Adults are way better at learning languages than kids. It's that kids have so much more time than we do. And we don't really... there's sort of this almost optical illusion of you look at this kid and you're like, well, they definitely haven't worked, and they're definitely way better than me at this language. And you're not taking into account the fact that they've stuck in 15,000 hours by the time that they hit the age of 5.
Just through like listening and just being around parents and family and teachers and all those sorts of things. Like they just have it all the time. Yeah.
And I mean, they're like, I think part of that illusion is that, kids start talking late. They'll start talking when they're 2 or 2.5 or something like that. And they'll sort of be saying simple things, and you don't really count them as like a person until they're starting to hit like 5 or 6. But they've been listening the whole time. They've been listening since they're like 0. Actually, I think that part of intonation stuff they've been picking up like in the womb. Like they have this huge head start on us. And when you start correcting for that, you start and you actually take good data and you say, okay, well, really, how good is how much exposure has this kid had? How much exposure has this adult had? And like, how good are they? The adult will win every single time. Like we are way, way, way better than kids at doing this. It's that we don't have the time to do it. And we need, because of that, because we have so much less time available since we have to do things in our regular lives, like work and do podcasts and things. We need methods that actually work better than what kids are doing, because you can't actually go to Spain or go to South America and take 15,000 hours to learn Spanish.
But one of the things that kids seem to do, or at least when teaching kids language, they seem to follow a method of, and it's like your method's kind of similar, where they start with like building blocks like sounds, and then move from sounds maybe into like, a couple sounds joined together, and then into words, and then kind of build up from there. Whereas with, when you start Spanish in high school, they're like, oh, here's this word like hablar, and you like try to butcher it in English, and then try to work backwards instead of working up from sounds.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said for how kids learn in terms of the order with which they pick things up, and I think there's things to be learned from that. But we can do better than what kids are doing. Mm-hmm. Even that. I mean, I think we can do way better than we're doing in classrooms, but I think we can also get past the kids. You were asking, like, what are some of these tools? I'd say one of the central ones is there's sort of two pillars on which this whole thing lands, which is one, building up memories in a way that actually sticks, and so that's talking about trying to figure out what you're actually trying to build here, because trying to memorize a translation is something that is one of the most forgettable things on the planet. If you're trying to learn a word like Hund in German, which means dog, learning that Hund and dog are the same thing, like from a brain standpoint, that's totally uninteresting. Like, why do you need this word Hund? You already have the word dog.
Yeah.
Who cares?
It's just redundant.
And things that it's like redundant information. It's like, hey, let me give you 13 words for the exact same thing. And it's like, well, I'm going to forget words, 2 through 13, because why do I care? Like, what do I need this for? It's when the words start having subtleties, having meanings that are new for you. Like, oh, this isn't just dog. This is like, hound. Like, this is some sort of like weird word that you'd use for dog that means like that you'd use in a weird context, like, the hound and the fox, like these sort of fairy tale things. Like, oh, this is a more fairy tale kind of dog. Like, those kind of words stick a little better because they mean something that isn't just a copy of what you know already. And so if you're going to try to build up a word, then you need to look at what is in that word, what is in that memory of that word. And for a word like dog, there's a lot of pieces to it. There's the sound of the word dog, which you've heard said by a million people in your life, and has all familiar sounds in it. So there's no part of that word that sounds foreign and is hard to grasp. That word is connected to a spelling that you learned when you were whatever, 5. And that spelling and that sound, they interconnect. And that's part of that memory of dog, but that also connects to every single image of a dog you've ever seen in your life and every single experience of dogs you've seen in your life. Words like tail, words like cat, words like bark, words like wag. Like, all of these things are contained within the word dog, and none of that is in the German word Hund. Mm-hmm. You don't have anything there. You don't have the word for tail. You don't have the word for cat. You don't have the word for wag. The sounds are a little unfamiliar, although Hund is pretty good in the sense of it lines up with a lot of English sounds, but still. If you're dealing with like Hungarian and I say, okay, well, the word for dog is kutya, that gets worse. Because because the sounds are weird. Like the example I usually bring up in talks and workshops and things is the Hungarian word for camera, fényképezőgép. It's a word you can't remember 1 second after you say it.
Yeah, I think in researching, in researching for this, I think I've heard you say it like 5 times, and I'm like, still,
I love
lost
that word.
It every
like,
time.
It's like it's. But there's other. I mean, it's like any language that has sounds that you haven't heard before. Those words are not going to even stick, even on a sound level, even on a level of just, can you repeat this word after me, and can you say this is the same as camera? And like, that's already you're not at a good place, even if you can repeat the word and say that's the same thing as camera, or that's the same thing as dog. And so when you start building memories by really building them up from scratch and saying, okay, can I hear the sounds? If I can't hear the sounds, how do I build up that ability? Yeah. Now I can hear the sounds. Okay, well, now let me connect that to something that's useful, not just connected to a translation, but I'm going to find pictures of, let's say, fényképezőgépek, like the cameras on the internet, that are in Hungarian. You realize that Hungarians choose different pictures than we do for cameras. And you think, that's interesting. This is not just camera. This is a special Hungarian form of like what they think of when they think of cameras. That's new information. Okay, good. And then you connect that to parts of your own life experiences, which is, or what are my experiences with fényképezőgépek? Like, what are my camera experiences? Do I have an iPhone, fényképezőgép? Like, do I have I taken pictures in my life, like which are fényképek? Like, just the part of that word is for pictures, because Hungarian is cool and it's like light picture taking machine. It's like that's that word.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And so you start making these connections, and suddenly that word is no longer this horrible foreign-sounding thing that's a copy of something that you're going to forget in 3 seconds. It's something that actually sticks and means something. And then you're in a position to actually start retaining things. I think one of the main issues with language learning is that you work on it for some time. You work on it for, let's say, a semester in college, and then you forget half of that semester by the time you're done. and then you keep going, and you take like I took 5.5 years of Russian, and I forgot probably like the first 5 years by the time I finished. And I think that's a really common experience, is that you forget all the time. And so the challenge becomes, how do you beat that? And that's sort of the first step of that is building memories that are memorable, instead of just trying to learn translations and badly pronounced things.
Yeah, that's one that idea was one of the biggest like things that struck me when I was reading the book. Just instead of trying to connect to translations, connect to the actual objects. And then even like, so as I'm trying to read now in Spanish, just like one of my first books, I'm like trying to think of, what the meaning, not trying to translate anymore. And it's like, it seems to flow better, and it just makes so much more sense when you actually think about it, because then you're like, when you're translating, you're basically learning how to speak English using Spanish words instead of actually learning how to speak Spanish.
Well, there's a reason why like simultaneous translators are paid like $200 to $300 an hour. It's one of the hardest things, period. Like, it's one of the most stressful jobs you can possibly have. It is so difficult to sit there and translate one language to another one. That is not something that people should be training how to do on like if they need to go traveling somewhere. Like, you should not have to become a UN translator to go to South America and have a good time. Like that is a brutal job. Like the hats off to those people. I cannot do that. And I don't want to do that. Like there are people who like just faint from the stress of doing those jobs. And then people go into language learning classes or things like this, and they decide, okay, well, all I need to do is just learn how to translate fast enough. And it's like, oh man, you're setting yourself up for like this goal that is so hard. And yes, it's possible, but like, man, why not just think in that language? Like, that is actually easier. And people are going for a goal that is way, way, way harder. And I think sometimes think that it must be easier. Well, translating is easier than thinking. And it's like, no, we're kind of designed to think in languages. We're not really designed to translate. That thing is really brutal to do.
Yeah, it makes conversation so much harder too. I know that's been one of my biggest struggles speaking Spanish is I'm listening to somebody speak in Spanish and I'm trying to think about it in English and then take the English response and convert it to Spanish. But the Spanish language is composed completely differently. So then it's almost impossible, because then you're like, like 1 second, just let me think about that answer.
Yeah, no, it's just too slow. I mean, there's no way to. I'm not going to say no way to speed it up that much. I think there is, but honestly, I think the only way that simultaneous translators like survive is that they've built up their ability to think in both languages so well that they can think a thought in Spanish and then be like, well, what's the same sort of way of saying that in English? Okay, think, and then they've already trained fluency so much that they can also translate. But the translation's an additional skill on top of the fluency, not the other way around.
And it seems like so many people identify language learning as this like super difficult thing, and then it becomes like, I noticed when I'm talking to people about it, it becomes like really like a utility based equation. When like I went to Czech Republic for like 3 weeks, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try to learn some Czech, and everyone I encountered was like, why are you doing that? Like, everyone there speaks English. Right. You're only there for 3 weeks. Like, all this work you're putting in doesn't equal the equation. But like, people don't really connect with the idea that it can be fun and enjoyable. I
think it's because people have had really, I think people have had hard times in classes, and they have that they're like, well, that didn't feel good. Why would you do that again?
Yeah.
In your own free time, especially, it's like, ugh. I think showing people that this thing can actually be enjoyable is really important, because I think there's a lot of enjoyment to be had in language learning. I mean, at the moment I've been learning I learned Hungarian for fun. Like, I don't have anyone to speak with. I speak with my tutor on italki now. I just I talked to him like half hour ago. And that's like the only thing I do with Hungarian. I originally learned it like with the potential idea of maybe I could speak with my grandmother in it, because it's one of her native languages. And she, I said something to her in Hungarian a few months ago, and she was like, "Oh, I don't have need for this language." That was the only conversation I had with her.
Did she say that in English or in Hungarian?
She said in English. No, in English. Yeah, I've never heard her say anything in Hungarian.
Oh, that's funny.
But I don't regret. I regret that she hasn't talked to me, but I don't regret learning Hungarian. Like, that, it's been so much fun to go through that process. It's been so much fun to sort of understand how my brain acts in that language. And so I'm really happy that I did that. I don't have any. It's fun. Right now, Japanese, like this language is fascinating. Like and building it is so much fun that it's like, if people only knew, is kind of this idea of like, well, I'm having fun. I wish people would know how to have fun in the same way.
Why do you think the education system has, I'll say, like failed so hard with communicating languages and teaching languages to kids?
I was actually just having a conversation about this with someone who wanted to potentially have like a round table between me and teachers and stuff, and they thought that I was like anti-teacher or anti-education, and I've been there. Like I've done. I haven't just been a student of languages. Like I taught English in Austria. Like I've been a language teacher before, and I think one of the main issues is that people are coming into this with faulty expectations. What people want from a teacher is something that they cannot provide, and that kind of makes this thing where people aren't talking about the same things. And what I mean by that is that what people often want by going to a language class is they want to be able to sit there, lie back in a chair, and have this person in front of them give them a language. And by the end of that class, they should be able to, talk in this language. And they're looking for a thing that's passive. Mm-hmm. You're looking for a thing that doesn't involve active participation, active creation. And you can't have it. Like, it's a thing that you cannot have that thing of just being able to sit there and maybe like lie back and listen to something, or sit there and, for instance, play with a game on a computer. Like, click on the thing that says, that's like, click on the right picture of the boy, or click on the girl, click on the ball. Like, this kind of pretty passive involvement is not something that is enough to actually change the way you think, because it's such a deep thing that you're messing with here. You're messing with like the way your brain works. Like, this is not something that's just kind of like, oh, I learned this fact about my friend on Facebook today. Like, this is something really intrinsic to the way that who you are, and so that has to be really, really active. And so I think what's happening is that students are showing up to a classroom saying, "Hey, give me this thing." Teachers are like, "I can't, so let's learn some translations."
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it ends up being that no one is really, maybe not no one, but few people are really aiming at what needs to be sort of central, which is, let me show you how to do this yourself, because I can't do it for you. And then I'll give you whatever resources I can give you as a teacher. And I think if classes were sort of reframed in that way, I think a lot of people would be mad, students included. In fact, maybe probably more the students than the teachers, in the sense that people would want to show up and be like, "What, you're just showing me how to do stuff? Like, you do it." But I think practically speaking, that's the only thing you can do, which is just, these are the tools you have available. Let's see how many tools we can collect here, show you how to use them all, and then give you content. Here's some sentences, here's some grammar, here's some words, but you've already learned how to learn them, so you learn them, and then we can keep giving you more content. And like, that ends up being a really effective classroom environment, but it's a classroom environment that's effective only for the people who are willing to put in that kind of involvement.
Mm-hmm. So it has to be like way more self-motivated and self-directed.
It can only be self-motivated and self-directed, I believe. I mean, the other option is, that's also self-motivated. The classes that have worked in terms of that consistently spit out students who speak the language are classes where everything is taught in the language. The students are forced to stay in that language all the time, even outside of class. And there is so much homework, 4 or 5 hours a day of homework, that the only thing the student interacts with is the language. And so by the end of it, they really don't, for one, have any time to forget it. And two, they don't have anything else in their lives going on, because there's so much class that they have to do the language all the time. And so you only get through that if you're willing to stick in the work and you're willing to be self-motivated anyway. And so those classes are absolutely effective, but the idea of being able to show up for an hour a week, or a couple hours a week, or even 3 classes a week for 3 hours at a time, like, if you're not willing to be the self-motivated person and stick this thing into your head, no one can do it for you. And so if you have that goal, you're kind of stuck, and the teacher's stuck too. So that.
When you're looking for, or when you're starting to learn Japanese, or when you went into Hungarian and you're trying to find a language tutor or a bit of a language teacher, what are you looking for in that relationship?
It depends if I'm a beginner or an intermediate. With Hungarian, what I was looking for was someone who had the patience to force me to stay in Hungarian all the time. I mean, not force me, I was willing to do it. But I needed to have someone who was willing to not jump to English as a crutch.
Like when you were struggling with it, to not just switch to English to try and explain it to you?
Yeah, where I could go like... today I was talking about this talk I gave in the Netherlands, and I realized I didn't have the word for talk, like to give a talk, and I didn't have the word for conference, and I didn't have all these words, and so we just started basically playing this game, which is basically like the that board game Taboo.
Yeah.
It's like the party game where like it's for any of your listeners who don't know the sense of like you have this card, it says baseball on it, and you're trying to make your team say baseball, but you can't say baseball, you can't say ball, you can't say like diamond, you can't say player, you can't say sport, and so you have to be like, hey, you know that thing that's like fun that you like get on the field and you hit the round sphere thing, and like it goes out into the ground and it like bounces and someone like picks up the sphere and like tosses it to the guy in the middle, and like eventually someone's like, oh, are you trying to talk about baseball? Because that's a weird way to talk about that. And then you win. And it's the same thing with languages, where the main goal of all my intermediate tutoring sessions is I want to be able to play Taboo as much as possible, because that is building fluency. That's exactly what fluency is. It's being able to not switch back to English. And so if I'm trying to talk about a talk, I gave this talk in the Netherlands and I don't have the words for it, then I was stuck basically going, hey, so I went to the Netherlands, you remember this? And he was like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so there were like 500 people there, and then like of those people, there were like 15 people, and they said stuff, and it was interesting stuff. What did they do? And he was like, oh, they gave a talk. And I was like, that's the word. And then I wrote down that word. And I was like, okay, well, what was I called? Like, what are the people who do those talks? And he's like, a talker. And I was like, oh, okay, well, Hungarian. They're very efficient with their words. And so I was like, okay. And so all these talks together, what are they called? And he's like, oh, that's a conference. And I was like, okay, that's the word for conference. And so that's what I'm looking for in an intermediate tutor, is someone who's willing to play that game with me and not just ask me, hey, what's the word you're looking for in English? Or just anytime I don't understand a word, he uses a new word that I don't know. I need someone who's willing not to just tell me the English definition, but is willing to explain it in Hungarian so that I can understand that concept in Hungarian, because it's useless for me to understand a Hungarian word in English.
Yeah, you're not going to memorize it that way.
Yeah. For the beginning Japanese stuff, that's a very, very different ballgame. What I'm looking for there is not practicing fluency, because I don't have any Japanese to be fluent in yet. And so this is sort of a new thing. This is something that I'm just experimenting with in this language, and it's working really well, which is that I'm taking a very, very small set of words that I've learned. I have this list of words on my website that I sort of go through. And I'll take one page of that list. Like, it'll be 6 words on a page, and they'll be sort of related. It'll be like, waiter, back, pain, stand, Friday. I think that might even be the set. And it's sort of, and there's like a picture up top of this waiter who has back pain and is like standing all day. And I'll go through these words with this tutor, and what I want is, hey, I have these words, let's make some sentences with them. So can you show me how to say the waiter is standing all day? Okay, well, we did that. Can you show me how to say because the waiter was standing all day, his back hurts? And we're like, okay, we did this. And I was like, okay, so let's try, I was standing all day and my back hurts, and so I want to sit. And so we'll just start playing with a very, very small group of words so that I can discover what the grammar does. Mm-hmm. And maybe learn a few other sort of functional words that I can't learn with just pictures. And so what I'm looking for in an intermediate tutor, honestly, are very, very good English skills. Not an intermediate, a beginner tutor. For the beginner tutors, in that case, I'm looking for very good English skills. But it's because I have to be speaking only in English, basically, and I have to let them show me how to create stories in Japanese. So they're very different, the two roles of those tutors. Eventually, later on, I'll switch to I'll either switch tutors or I'll ask the tutors to switch entirely into Japanese, and so I'll lose the English crutch. But for now, I'm just trying to explore the grammar, and so I'm using them kind of like a textbook.
And how did you, what point do you get to in a language where you're kind of like, or with Hungarian, when you wanted to switch to Japanese? What kind of motivated you to take on a new language?
You just kind of have to decide when you're done, and there's no good set point. I mean, you can decide that, I think, especially for people who are traveling a lot, I think it's nice to say, okay, well, I have this trip coming up in 6 months, so I'm going to learn this language for the next 6 months, and I'm going to go on this trip, and it's going to be awesome, and that's that. Mm-hmm. And I think that those make good goals. I think you can set up programs. You're like, I'm going to take this, in the case of French and Russian for me, it was like, okay, I have this immersion program in the summer. I'm going to take, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, do it entirely in that language. I want to build up as much as I can until that program. And so I'll take 3 months, I'll take 6 months, and or Russian, I think I took 8 months. And I'll learn as much as I possibly can before the program. I'll take the program, and then I'll feel like, okay, I got somewhere. This is good, I'm done. In the case of Hungarian, I really wanted to learn Japanese. Really, really, really wanted to learn Japanese. And so I just decided, I'm having conversations in Hungarian. We're able to talk the whole time for an hour or whatever about random things. We have this, like, if we don't know what to talk about our days, then we were going through this giant list of, like, getting to know each other questions. What are your favorite pets? What are your, just random stuff? Mm-hmm. And so we were going through all of these questions in Hungarian exclusively and talking about them. And it was like, okay, well, this is fun. I no longer need to sit at a computer and write this stuff down. I can sit in the car, for instance, and chat. Well, okay, then I think I'm happy enough with where I am in Hungarian for my own needs, which is that I'm not planning to move to Hungary. I'm not planning on writing anything in Hungarian, like books or anything. I want to be able to hold a conversation. I am holding a conversation. Good enough. I'm going to go to Japanese.
That's cool.
But I could have absolutely continued. I mean, I am not, at a, like my German, for instance, I lived there for 6 years. My German is fantastic, is good. I mean, it's as good as I would ever want it to be. My Hungarian's not at that level. And I could certainly spend another year or 2 or 3 just building Hungarian. I could spend, the next 10 years becoming a Hungarian professor, I mean, whatever. But I just kind of want to hold a conversation. So I feel like that's good enough for what I want. And I think setting goals based on what you actually want or need is really important, because I think sometimes people have this goal of, like, I want to be fluent, and you have to figure out what that means for you, because fluency is a whole different, like, there are worlds difference between fluency you need to, like, to travel, fluency you need to hold a conversation about random stuff, fluency you need to hold a really good conversation about, molecular physics. Like, there's worlds of difference between these things, and people really have different needs, and customizing your language learning thing to fit those needs is I think really important and not talked about that much.
So what's your goal for Japanese?
Japanese, I want to be as good as my German. Japanese, I want to be my best language. I have always really, really, really been attracted to that language. And at this point, my girlfriend is really, really interested in learning Japanese also. And having a couple's language is huge. I mean, having a language that you and your partner speak, and especially that you've learned together, is just a wonderful thing to have. I had this with my ex-wife in German, and I want that back. And so with Japanese specifically, it's like, okay, well, this is something we're doing together. I want this to be, like, super fluent. And so, and also because I always wanted to. I've always loved Japanese. So that this language is going to be a really high priority. I'm probably going to spend at least a year and a half, probably 2 years on it, and really focus on it for a good chunk of time.
And have you found that, you are on language number 6, did you say, or number 7?
This is 7, but that's including English, so it's always cheating.
Okay. Has it gotten easier to learn them as, like, after your second language? Like, were you like, okay, I know how to learn another language now, and then it gets easier?
Absolutely. You get it's a skill that you're developing. The language learning skill is a skill that you develop. You realize which tools work for you well, and you realize how to use them. With Japanese, there's a section in my book I talk about how to memorize grammatical gender, because it's this horrible thing. I mean, it's just terrible. Like, you're like, why is that male? Like, this should be, like, it's a female cat. Why is it male?
I know, like, it makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And so gender is one of these horrible abstract things that makes no sense, that is not even really about gender at all. It's about like, what category of word is this thing? Like, for instance, we like in the closest thing we have in English is countable and uncountable. There's no reason why you can't say, hey, I have 2 luggages here, except that it's wrong. Like, why can't you say I have 3 luggage? I have 4 luggages. There's 7 luggages here. Like, it makes perfect sense. He told me 1 information. Like, these kind of things, these actually exist in other languages. German uses the word Information, like the same word. And if someone tells you 2 things, you say, they told me 2 informations, and you told me 1 thing, they say, they told me 1 information. And that makes perfect sense. And it's a concept that, like, anytime you hear someone speaking with slightly bad English, theoretically, like a German comes in and says, oh yeah, he told me an information. It's not like you don't understand what they're saying. You know exactly what they're saying. It's just wrong. Yeah. And it's the same thing with grammatical gender. Like, you're using, the masculine form, it should be feminine. It's not that it doesn't, that thing should be masculine. Like, it has its core is masculine. Like, no, it's just, that's the category of word it is. In the same way that luggage is uncountable in English for no reason. And the reason is that really we like categorizing things. Humans have this tendency of just putting things in categories because it makes everything feel better. But in the book, I talk about this sort of method of memorizing gender, where you turn it into imagery, and you say, okay, well, everything that is masculine in this language is going to catch on fire, and everything that's feminine in this language is going to melt into goo or something. And suddenly you can start attaching that to words in a very, very easy way, where you're like, okay, dog explodes, cat explodes, bed explodes, like, computer monitor melts, desk melts. And that's the sort of thing that sticks, because imagery sticks. And it's a really basic way of taking imagery and using it to learn something abstract. Once you get a feel for how to do that, because the gender thing is really concrete, it's really, really easy to take a group of students, for instance, in a language workshop and say, okay, here are 15 words. Let's tell some stories about those things exploding or melting or whatever, vanishing in a pile of dust or whatever. And everyone within a few minutes will have all of those words memorized with the right gender, everything like that. And it's really cool to see, and it's very simple. You can take that a lot further. And so you can take that kind of imagery idea and start applying it to everything. And so at this point, I'm using images to learn all of the Japanese characters, like the kanji, the really complex characters. And so every single word in Japanese now has like 5 or 6 images associated with it. And if I was just starting out and this is my very first language, it would be really hard to jump all the way into that much imagery and jump into just using all those tools to that degree. So as you build up languages, as you build up experience doing this stuff, you start building up a tool set that you can keep reusing for more languages.
And how do you feel like that plays, like when you're learning language number 4, do you think that improves language 3, language 2, English? Or do you feel like
I think it improves your skill set in terms of your ability to learn languages and your ability to learn in general. In terms of every language I learn sort of actually has a negative effect on the other languages. Like right now, I had, because of all the traveling I've been doing in the last month, I hadn't been doing my Hungarian lessons, for instance, for a month. And I had been continuing my Japanese stuff. And so I got back into this conversation, and the words that were coming to my head were in Japanese. Like, even as rudimentary as my Japanese thing is, like the words that I was looking for, like the word for to love, and I'm like, oh, that's aisuru, and like, well, that's the wrong language, crap. And so these are with languages that have no connection at all. Like, if you're trying to learn Italian and you already have Spanish down, the Italian will murder your Spanish. Like, that's like related languages murder each other. Even unrelated languages attack each other. So I wouldn't say that it's a benefit in terms of learning additional languages, in terms of improving your original ones, but it keeps improving your skill set. It keeps improving your toolbox.
Okay. And then when you went, when you're traveling, like you said, you went to Holland for a couple weeks. Do you always try to learn a bit of the language, or of the country you're going to, or how do you approach that?
Always is strong. This was one time where I really didn't. I didn't have time, and so it was sort of uncomfortable. I was like, oh, I really don't know this language, and people were sort of asking me like, hey, have you picked up Dutch? And I'm like, no, I really haven't. I do try, though. I think when certainly if I had more time, or if I knew I was going to be there for a protracted amount of time. I mean, my Holland trip was 5 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty quick.
Yeah, and they kept me going the whole time. They were like, Erica, you're going to get off the plane, and 4 hours later you have your first interview. Like, that was not a time for me to sort of hang out and soak up the culture. But I did take a trip to Japan several years ago, long before I did any of this language stuff, really, through 2008, I think. And it was a 5-week trip. It was an opera tour. And it was like, okay, well, I definitely need to pick up some Japanese. And so I studied that travel guide as much as I could. And it was really helpful. I mean, really knowing some of the language when you're there is huge. I mean, I felt it really uncomfortable in Holland and I felt a lot more comfortable in Japan, of all places.
Yeah, that's kind of my experience too. Like, I feel like on my personal level, like when you go into somewhere and you just have so I was in Czech Republic and then Hungary, and it's like I have like literally zero skills. Like I can't just approach you in English. Like that seems kind of rude. But people are like, oh yeah, just do that.
It's rude. Yeah.
Yeah, especially as an English speaker rude. Too. I feel like it's like to go and just assume that somebody in another country just speaks English because it's this worldwide language. It just feels so ignorant. It does. It feels ignorant. The problem, I think one of the problems is that it ends up being true, is that most people generally do speak English, and so you can sort of get away. Like if you only spoke Hungarian, like the thought would never come to your head of like, hey, I'll just speak to this guy in Hungarian and he'll probably get it. Like, no, he won't. But English does generally work that way, and so you can get away with it, and you're often stuck having to do that. Like if you really need help and you're in the middle of the Czech Republic, you have to just assume, or at least ask and be like, hey, do you speak English? And you can't even ask the question in Czech, which sucks. Like if you have anything like the one thing that's really useful to have in the language is like, hey, I'm really sorry, I don't speak Czech. Like that's a useful thing to be able to say in Czech. But without even that, I mean, it feels uncomfortable. You feel rude. Like I felt rude in Holland.
Yeah, it's funny in the Czech, so I did learn, like, do you speak English in Czech, which is like mluvite anglicky, if I'm probably butchering that. But I would try that out, and people are like, oh, yeah, you just pronounce it so badly that people here aren't used to hearing bad pronunciation. So they're like, what are you talking about? They respond to me in English, and they're like, I don't even know what you mean when you're saying that. Yeah,
and that's one of the like early in the book, there's this one section. My editor actually asked me this thing. He said, well, give me something practical. Like we were having this big sort of fight about the book, and he was like, I have a date in 4 hours, Cambodian supermodel. What do I do? And my answer to him, and the answer I stick with, is like, if you can learn how to say anything well, it's way better than being able to memorize 15 sentences badly.
Yeah, for sure.
Like if you could say one word that's really, really clear and good and sounds like Czech, like that's going to actually be useful and affect someone. So yeah, I mean, I think picking up like you have these travel guides, and in the travel guide in the beginning, like it'll say like, okay, well, here's how you pronounce the language, and it's like bonjour, Jama, pale Gabriel. Like, that is useless. Just throw that thing out, like that part. Like,
yeah, and that was kind of one of my frustrations learning Spanish in South America, is I would have this sentence down packed as to how to order my food or ask for a train ticket, and then they'd just be like, what? I'm like, oh, I'm saying this right. Like, I swear I am. It's so discouraging to feel like that.
That's yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons I really push starting with pronunciation, is that one of the issues is that, for one, is the memorization thing. Like, if you can't hear the word, you can't remember it, as we talked about with the Fenyke Bezergabe thing. But also, if you can't say that word right, then who's gonna, like, if you can't actually convey the thing that's in your head, then you're sort of screwed from the start. So yeah, I mean, that's it takes some work, and it takes some tools that generally haven't been very available. I mean, with pronunciation especially, it's rough in the sense that if you're dealing with a language that has some sounds that you've never heard before, you can't just listen to them a bunch of times and therefore get it.
Yeah.
And so you need to have something better than that. You need to have some sort of testing thing where you can really be tested on, can you hear the difference between, tuk or juk, or if you're Japanese, can you hear the difference between rock and lock? And someone to actually test those things until you can hear them, because if they're not tested, just repeating them isn't going to do it. It's sort of a big topic, and we're kind of running out of time, so I don't want to jump into it that much. But the sound thing is really key, and I think it never gets quite as much emphasis as it needs to have.
And I know you have pronunciation trainers on your website, fluentforever.com. Are those more for the listening side or for the speaking as well?
Both. I guess going into that research, there was a series of studies done in the early 2000s about teaching Japanese adults how to hear the difference between rock and lock, like the sort of classic language problem. And there was really clear advice that came out of those studies in terms of how to teach that. And I haven't seen it anywhere. I haven't seen it used anywhere. And so I built one for myself. I built a little thing that basically, what it does is it takes two words that sound similar to my ear. In Hungarian, in this case, this very first trainer that I made for myself, it had kar, kor, kor. That third one is slightly longer than the second one. Like, what? That's a different word. It had tuk and juk, which
it sounds
still
exactly
sound
the same
pretty.
Almost, yeah.
You're right. And so odd and odd, extra long D's, like crazy stuff that you're like, what? You're supposed to be able to hear the difference between those things. And so I had a Hungarian speaker record those, just a bunch of pairs of words that are really, really similar. And then I set up a program to test me on them. And just said, which of these two words? Is it odd or is it odd with the double D? Is it kor or kor with the long O? And it would say one of those words at random, and I would have to guess which one it was. And every time I guessed, it would say whether I was right or wrong. That's it. Like relatively straightforward in the sense of just recording one of two words, choose the word, that's it. And in 10 days, I could hear all the sounds in Hungarian. And I could pronounce them. And it's nuts. I mean, it was like I had spent so much time in school because of my opera degree learning French pronunciation and learning German pronunciation, and this just blew all of them out of the water in like 10 days. It was just stupidly good, and I didn't understand why people haven't used this to make products and make like tools that people could use. And so I did that early on in the book just as an experiment. And after seeing how well it worked, I decided I needed to make this stuff. I need to make it available because while I can show people how to make it themselves, and it didn't take that long. I mean, it took me like 4 hours to make this thing. And I have instructions on my website how to make it yourself. And those 4 hours saved me months of time. So it was like definitely time that was well spent, but people don't necessarily want to put in that time. And that's time that could be spent, if that product existed already, just working on more language stuff. So I set up a sort of mission, like I need to get these things out. And so I had a Kickstarter and used that to fund development of these things. And so that's been my full-time job, like every single day of the week job for a year and a half now. And probably will continue for another year or so, making these pronunciation trainers. And they affect not just how you hear, but also that has a very direct effect on what you can speak. One of the things that came out of these studies with the Japanese adults was that as soon as they could learn how to hear the difference between rock and lock, they could start pronouncing it correctly.
Wow.
Which was just really cool. There wasn't any direct pronunciation training where they weren't telling them where to stick their tongues or anything. It was just, you can hear it, now you can say it.
Oh, so they didn't even have to learn about like the tongue movements and nothing like that.
Wow.
No, nothing.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That is really cool.
Like our ears and our mouths are really intimately connected. There's a sort of direct path going on there that's like, if you can hear it, generally you can say it. There are times where you can't, like with the Spanish rolled R that gives a lot of people a lot of problems.
I was just thinking about that because
that's the one that always comes up. People are like, but what about the rolled R? And I'm like, yeah, I know. That
it just cannot trill, and it just throws my Spanish off so badly.
Yeah, no, that one just takes time. Both of the trills, there's the back trill in German and the front trill in Spanish, and they're just brutal. But And those things, I mean, it's not to say that you don't benefit from learning how to say things, meaning in terms of real discussion of like, where does your tongue go and stuff like that. But if you can't hear it, you can't say it. You can't consistently say it because you can't autocorrect. You don't have the feedback to say, well, did I do it right or not? Like if you're just guessing, there's no way. You have to be able to hear yourself, basically, to give yourself the feedback to do something correctly. So hearing is sort of the first step, and then the second step is kind of going back and being like, okay, well, if I can hear it really, and I'm still having problems, then let's talk about what's going on with your tongue.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Anyways, we're pretty much out of time here, but yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for coming on to the podcast. If anyone listening is planning on going traveling soon and is not planning on learning a language, I definitely say pick up Fluent Forever. And it really motivated me to be like, oh, I want to learn some more languages and like get back into Spanish. It's like quite motivating because you're like, oh, this is actually like straightforward instead of being like this complicated thing you're approaching.
I think it's, as I said before, I think it's really important that people understand that this thing can actually be fun, and not only can it be, it has to be, because it takes time, and sticking to something that sucks is not something you can actually motivate yourself to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true.
Awesome. So. And then if people want to find out more about you, it's like fluent-forever.com.
Yeah, I mean, the website has sort of the whole picture. But yeah, I mean, just you can go on Amazon, grab Fluent Forever, and that will probably be the best introduction to all this stuff at once. Cool. There are other things. There's like workshops and all sorts of stuff. But I think the book is the sort of the easiest path in terms of really getting a sense of what all this is about.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
So that's the interview with Gabriel Wyner. We're going to have some show notes up on www.theworldwanders.com that'll have links to his website and some of his resources. So definitely go check those out. I would also highly recommend checking out Fluent Forever. And just keep in mind
fluent-forever.com.
Oh yeah, I meant the book though. But yeah, the website as well. We'll put a link up on the show notes to his website for sure. And if you're planning a trip this summer, fall, 2 years from now, definitely consider learning the language wherever you're going to be. And hopefully hearing Gabriel Wyner and his enthusiasm and passion for language learning has inspired you to potentially go out and learn that language. I know I'm definitely feeling re-inspired to progress with my Spanish.
And if you are interested in language learning, we talk about our experiences going to Spanish school in our Buenos Aires episode. And we also have an episode, if you are learning Spanish, where we talk about our top 5 favorite tools for learning Spanish, which it was before my introduction to Fluent Forever. So I would probably add that to the list.
I would definitely add that to the list. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, feel free to contact us on Facebook, Twitter.
Don't feel free. Contact us.
Just do it.
We want your questions.
Facebook, Twitter, our website. Thanks so much for listening.
And our website is
www.theworldwanders.com.
Ciao.
Bye.